The Linux kernel version 5.7.2 has just recently come out, and there's been some improvements to it, like better support for OLED displays and Tiger Lake integrated graphics. There's been updates to the XFS and exFAT file systems, as well as fast charge support for iOS devices over a USB connection. Now, I probably won't be using that particular feature. I'm not really into overpriced devices with limited settings that you can change and paying extra money for a brand, but the normies are, and Linux needs the normies to dominate the desktop space. It just needs more and more people using it so that it can be the dominant desktop OS, which is its rightful place. So, let's do what we always do in Gentoo when a new kernel is released. Let's emerge it, configure it, and then compile it. Now, before we can emerge kernel version 5.7.2, or even to get onto version 5.4.38 like I have here, there's a few prerequisites. You see, neither one of these kernels are considered stable as far as Gentoo is concerned. I think 4.9 or maybe 4.8 or maybe even 4.2 is the latest stable kernel on Gentoo. Now, what this means is the Gentoo devs have not put these kernels through all of the thorough, rigorous testing that it needs to be considered stable. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have problems on your system if you use one of these kernels, but if you're using a system, or if you need to have a system with something like a 5 nines uptime, then it might not be the best idea to use a non-stable kernel, because in that case, you might not end up having 5 nines uptime. You might have to take your system down to fix some things or revert to an earlier kernel. So just keep that in mind before you do this type of kernel upgrade. But in order to get a later or a newer kernel on those of us who don't have those type of systems, this is what you'll have to do. Vim into etc portage package.accept keywords, or open it up with whatever text editor you prefer to use. And of course, make sure you do it as root, because you need root privileges to edit this file. And you're going to want to add this line here, syskernel gentoo sources. That is the name of the actual kernel package, at least the kernel package that has the Gentoo relevant patches applied to it. And then this keyword here, AMD64, just like with every other package, I know I covered this in my package.use video, but basically this means pull in the latest bleeding edge version of that package, regardless of whether or not it's considered stable. And you also want to make sure that there's no numbers after this. Like if you were to actually add 5.7.0, then this is going to be the latest version of the package it can pull in. Actually, this isn't valid syntax either. You need to have that equal sign in front of it as well. But if you get rid of it and you just give it the package name without a version, then it's automatically going to pull in that kernel version. So go ahead and add that to the file. And then you also want to perform an emerge sync. So this is going to sync with the Gentoo repository so that when you run portage, it's actually going to be looking for the latest versions of all of your packages, not just the kernel, but all the packages on your system. So I highly recommend doing this, especially if you haven't done a sync in a while, but even if you just did a sync like a week ago, you should run it again. Really, you should always run it before you go to upgrade your kernel, because things like the Linux kernel get updated very frequently. Like we just had 5.7.2 get released on, I believe it was June the 10th. And I wouldn't be surprised if within a week or two, certainly before July, kernel version 5.8 is probably going to come out, or maybe 5.7.3, something like that. So yeah, go ahead and do the emerge sync. And then once you've got that taken care of, the command to actually start emerging the kernel is going to be this: emerge update deep with bdeps equals y, new use sys kernel gentoo sources. Now, this is how you would see it be done on like the Gentoo wiki or the Gentoo forums if you've looked up how to do this. But this is the more verbose version of the commands, and personally I like to use shortcuts for commands whenever I can. So the shorthand version of this very same command is emerge hyphen lowercase u, capital D, capital N, Q with bdeps equals y, and then again, name of the package, syskernel gentoo sources. So the lowercase u, this stands for update, capital D stands for deep, capital N stands for new use, lowercase q, this actually stands for quiet. So what the quiet option is going to do is it's going to emerge our packages, but it's not going to give us a very verbose output. Like, it's not going to give us any output from the compiler. It's basically just going to emerge the packages, give you the name of the packages that it's updating, and it's going to also give you output if there's an error, like if you need to change anything with your package.use or package.accept keywords, then it's going to tell you that as well. So I guess I've already updated my system because it looks like it's only going to be pulling in just the syskernel gentoo sources. That's good for a video, I guess. Don't really have to pause it. Just gonna wait a couple of minutes for that emerge to finish. All right, so our emerge has finished. Now, unlike most packages, our kernel is not actually installed right now. I know it said right here that it was installing syskernel gentoo sources, but this is a little bit misleading because unlike most packages on Gentoo, when you download a new kernel, it doesn't get installed. You have to actually go into the sources and you have to build the kernel manually. So I'm going to go ahead and show you guys how to do that as well. I'm going to go ahead and become root at this point because most all of the commands that I'm going to run from here forward require root access, and I just don't feel like typing sudo in front of each one of them. But you could if you don't feel comfortable becoming root for whatever reason. So the first thing I'm actually going to do is I'm going to copy my current kernel configuration. So I'm going to copy that from usr src linux, and the name of the file is .config. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy that into my home folder here, and I'm going to name it so that I can keep track of what this is actually a configuration for, because if you're going to end up updating your kernel a lot, then it might just be a good idea to do that, right? Like, you don't want to have a bunch of different configurations and not know which one's which. So we'll call it uname r so that it gets that, and then .config. So you can see this right here is my configuration file for the kernel that I'm currently using. And the next thing to do is going to be to update our symlink for Linux. So if I do a quick lsl inside of this Linux directory, you'll see that this folder, Linux, is actually symlinked to this right here, Linux 5.4.38. This folder contains the sources for this version of the kernel. So we want to update it to point to 5.7.2. So if we do eselect kernel list, we see the same thing here. So to update that symlink, just do eselect kernel set 2, since this is the second thing in the eselect list. And so now if we do the eselect list again, you'll see that it's now pointing to 5.7.2. Same thing with our Linux folder. It's now pointing to 5.7.2. So we got that taken care of. Next thing is going to be to clean up the configuration that is inside of this Linux directory, because anytime that you get a new kernel, you get a new configuration file, but we don't want to really use that new one. We're going to be using the one that I just backed up with this new kernel as well. We'll get more into that once we get ready for that step, but the command to clean up your config is make mrproper. And this command basically does a make clean, but without creating any additional artifacts. So the make clean is basically already applied. Running make clean before running this is not going to be necessary. So now we want to copy that that kernel folder. I believe it was, yeah, there we go, into here and call it .config. So now, actually I gotta do lsla. All right, so now you can see this .config file is here inside of the Linux folder, that same file that we just copied from our home folder. And at this point, there's a few options we could do. We could make menu config. And this is actually what I would recommend if you're upgrading from a much older kernel to this one. Like if you were on kernel version 4 point whatever, it's probably just a good idea to go ahead and do a whole new kernel configuration, because I would imagine that there's going to be so many different options and they're going to be moved into different places on kernel version 4 compared to kernel version 5.7.2. But as you saw, I'm going from version 5.4 to 5.7.2. Not a huge difference there. So what I'm actually going to do instead is I'm going to make old def config. And what this is going to do is it's going to copy over all of the old configuration options to the new kernel. And any new options that are in this kernel that don't exist in my current one, like the things I mentioned, the exFAT support, the iOS device support, those are just going to get set to their default settings. All right, we have our configuration applied. Now what we're going to want to do is mount our boot partition. Now, my boot partition, it's a little bit different than what you guys may have seen before. This is my fstab file right here. So you can see that for boot, I'm using the UUID of my drive, or my virtual drive, since this is a virtual machine. UUID, it's a unique identifier for drives, whereas like dev SDA1, SDA2 is not. So the syntax to mount this type of drive is a little bit different. Basically what you want to do is, we're still going to use the mount command, but you need to give it the capital U option. And then you need to specify the UUID that you want to mount. So it's going to be this one right here for boot. Go ahead and put that. Oh, it didn't quite copy correctly. All right, there we go. And then we're going to mount that to boot as the mount point. You can see mine's already mounted, but just wanted to show you guys that step in case yours isn't mounted for whatever reason. So now that we have that taken care of, we want to prepare our modules to be rebuilt. If you're using modules in your kernel instead of just building everything directly into your kernel, then you're going to have to do this. I actually don't think I have any modules, but I'll go ahead and do this anyway, it doesn't hurt. So make modules prepare. All right, so this went ahead and prepared all my modules. So now it's time to actually start compiling this kernel. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make, and I'm going to use J4 as my makeops. So I've covered makeops in other videos, but I'll just give you a brief overview of it right now. So if I start up htop, you can see that on this system, I have 3 CPU cores. And again, this is a virtual machine. I don't have some type of crazy exotic CPU with only 3 cores, or 3 threads rather. So when you go to set your makeops, you basically want to have this integer right here be equal to your number of CPU threads plus 1. So since I have 3 CPU threads, I'm going to set my makeops to 4. And I'm going to string together a couple of commands here. So make J4 and make modules install, and make install is going to go ahead and write the binary of this new kernel to boot. So let's go ahead and run this. And this will probably take like a minute or two, so I'll go ahead and pause the video just to save everybody's time. All right, so my kernel has finished compiling, and I don't know if you guys paid attention to this up here, but my CPU was at 100% for pretty much the entire time that this kernel was compiling. That's the beauty of setting your makeops. Might as well use the CPU if you've got it. So now, typically what I'll do at this point is I'll just do an ls of the boot directory to make sure that I actually have the configs for the new kernel there. So I have a config for 5.7.2, I've got the VM linux for 5.7.2, and I've got the system map. The system map I'm pretty sure is just for debugging purposes though, so it's not like a super critical thing, but it's there. That's what really matters. All right, so we got that taken care of. Now there's a couple of other things that we need to do before we can reboot into this kernel. We want to emerge at module rebuild to go ahead and get those modules rebuilt. All right, and then no outdated packages found on my system. That's very good. Then we're going to output this configuration to grub. So we're going to do a grub mk config o boot grub grub.cfg. All right, so it went ahead and added this configuration file to it as well. So now, if we cross our fingers and pray to Tux, we should be able to reboot into this kernel. Let's go ahead and give it a go. All right, let's see, does it show up in here? Yes, it does. So let's see, it should automatically boot into that kernel. Yep, so it says 5.7.2. Let's see, does my GUI still work? Hey, the GUI still works. It's always good when that happens. So there you go. That's how you upgrade your kernel in Gentoo Linux. I hope you guys found this video useful. If you did, be sure to give it a like and share it so that other people can benefit from this as well, even if they're a normie, because like I said, we need the normies to grow the Linux space so that we can finally dominate Windows, dominate the Mac OS, have Tux be, you know, the base type of operating system to use. Yeah, that makes sense. Let's have Linux become the new dominate operating system of the world. Anyway, enough Linux fanboyism. Peace out, guys.